Me speaking right now. This is sort of the whole radius of the meeting. Can you hear everything I'm saying, you guys?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Rick?
Yes, that's fine.
We're good. Yeah, just speak up. Except for Anna.
Except for Anna.
All right, are we recording?
Yep.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for making it to soon-to-be sunny Newport. Thanks for joining us for the third Rulemaking Advisory Committee meeting for Ocean Renewable Energy. Why don't we just go around the table real quick and introduce ourselves? And just, if you want to let us know what you've been up to, that'd be great.
Jerry Hudson, Department of State Lands, Proprietary Coordinator for Coos and Curry County currently.
And I'm Sabrina from State Lands, and I'm the Rules Coordinator.
Walter Ports. Andy Lanier with DLCD.
Jason Bush with OWIT.
Charlie Clavin, Surfrider Foundation.
Hugh Link, Oregon Indigenous Craft Commission.
Justin Kluwer, Pacific Energy Ventures.
Laurel Hillman, Oregon Parks and Recreation Department.
Delia Kelly, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Chris Costelli, Oregon Department of State Lands. Kirk Jarvie could not join us today. We've recruited a couple of folks to help us out at DSL with some of the rulemaking. A gentleman named Mike DeBlasi, who is a removal fill coordinator, is going to help with the general permit regulatory rulemaking a little bit. He couldn't make it today, so we'll have any regulatory folks today. And then Jerry's going to help a little bit with the proprietary rulemaking. Jerry's been a land manager and in the land management division for quite some time. She's actually going to be handling some ocean-related permitting coming up soon. And Mike DeBlasi actually convened the first JART, I think, for...
Whoever's talking, you're talking way too low or away from the mic. And we heard about half of the people who were in attendance there. Is somebody going to take minutes and send it out to the group to let us know who all was in attendance at this meeting?
You want to just move up to the council?
Yeah.
All right. You know what? Give us 5 minutes. We're going to move up to the city council seats and take the third additional. There's mics at every station.
Wonderful.
It's all your plug in your cell phone.
Yeah, there you go. Can you guys hear me on this? On the phone?
Yeah.
Awesome.
I don't know if you want to put that on my seat. Apparently.
Send us to the GA. Or G. It's cool. Yeah, I think there's a.
Yeah, I'll bring it up in just a second.
Andy's that chair open at the end?
Yeah.
Right, video games.
Smash screen.
Let's see.
All right, so thank you guys for making it out here today to Newport, and hopefully it was a short commute for at least a few people here. Bathrooms. Bathrooms are out the door to the left. Make another left. and then some lights. So just like you're going past the city manager's office, there's some donuts. Please help yourself to them. We are going to went through welcome and introductions. I don't really think we have much on housekeeping. Hopefully the conference call is working well for everyone on the phone now. We're going to kind of follow up on a few items. We have a couple items to follow up on that we didn't get to last meeting, and one of them we can run through pretty quickly, I think. We're just going over the two checklists that DSL developed in conjunction with DLCD with regards to the inventory requirements for Part 5. The other one we'll get to a little later is the structure of the chart as it is comprised in Part 5. And since we're doing rulemaking, we'll have a discussion about what's in there and what we may or may not need to flush out in the rulemaking, DSL rulemaking. I want to go back and talk a little bit more about first right to apply and seeing if there's any way to kind of connect testing to scientific testing to a pilot or demonstration project to an ocean energy facility lease. I also had a telephone conference with BOEM to discuss their sort of decommissioning process. I want to share that results with you and sort of have a discussion about that as well. And then come up with a game plan for meeting 4, which I think we will have some draft rule language for you to look at that meeting. And then even touch base a little bit on our thoughts for meeting 5 and 6 too. Somebody please remind me, Jerry or Sabrina, to make sure there's an opportunity for public comment prior to the end of this meeting. I highlighted it on my agenda so I don't forget last time. And then we'll go from there. Probably have another meeting next week, sometime after Labor Day. So does anybody have any questions right now?
Should we redo introductions for the people on the phone?
Sure, let's do them real quick. I'm Chris Castelli, Department of State Lands. I'm sorry to have to come back down.
Laurel Hillman, Oregon Parks and Recreation Department.
Delia Kelly, ODFW.
Walter Chuck, Court Report.
U-Link, Oregon Dungeness Crab Commission.
Charlie Cliven, Surfrider Foundation.
Jason Bush, OED. Justin Kluwer, Pacific Energy Ventures.
Andy Lanier, TLCD.
Jared Benson, Department of State Lands.
And Sabrina from Department of State Lands.
And the two folks on the phone?
Joanne Manson, Oregon Military Department.
Rick Williams, Lives Maritime.
Thank you guys. So let's start out with just briefly, one of your homework assignments was to take a look at the resource inventory checklist and effects evaluation checklist that was developed by DSL and DLCD. That'll go along with any applications that will be submitted to the department for ocean renewable energy projects, and of course, the checklist for the operation plan development as well. We have a Part 2 checklist. The inventories are sort of set up in a way in the territorial sea plan that they lend themselves to just sort of coming up with what you see in front of you. I think we covered everything. We double checked it and then checked it with Andy. I didn't know if you had any thoughts. It's sort of prescribed really based on what's in Part 5. But I wanted to give everyone an opportunity to take a look at it, comment if they have any comments on the checklists.
Do you have a copy of that with you?
I do. I just have a couple. Let me pass it over to you.
Appreciate it.
So this is Delia. I just had one question. So
Yes.
I think it's a good idea to provide developers some direction on where to find the information that's required by the inventory and evaluation. And what the direction that this handout provides is directs developers to Oregon Marine Map, which I don't believe is currently operational. So I'm just wondering if we could generalize on where the data would be housed instead of telling them to go to one specific place.
That will be stood up again very shortly.
Okay.
So we are in the process of replacing the outdated non-functional version. And we're maybe 3/4 of the way through to reestablishing that.
Great. So in terms of like in the long haul though, Oregon Marine Map will be something
That
that
will be a stable location that we can continually depend upon and send people.
Thank you.
And currently in the leasing rules, and I think this will continue, there's a pre-application process. My hope is when that developer comes in, and actually we'll end up formalizing that pre-application process a little bit through this rulemaking, that when those folks come in, we'll have groups of agency representation and other stakeholders who can help guide them through, depending on what their early project description is, help guide them through the checklists about A, what's important, and B, where they can maybe find some of that information to help them submit an adequate or complete application and supplemental checklists. And you'll notice about checklists, we did add a box about testing in NIMRIC, yes or no, as I think was the idea from OPAC and through Part 5, is that there's quite a few breaks on what's required if you go through NIMRIC. So it also means I don't think you need an operation plan at all, and also streamlines your application process.
So a comment on that. So my understanding is that there are breaks for testing at the North Energy Test Site, which is called the Mobile Test Site here.
Yep.
That doesn't necessarily extend to the South Energy Test Site once it's permitted. So
it's outside territorial sea for one thing, and it's not anticipated at all by the territorial sea plan as far as I'm concerned.
right. So my question then is whether or not we would stick with the language of the mobile test site, because it's already in Part 5.
Mm-hmm.
We would stick with that language instead of what is currently being called the North Energy Test Site. To clarify the difference. So NIMRIC encompasses both sites,
Yes, ma'am.
or will eventually encompass both sites. But the breaks that you're talking about do not.
So perhaps we should say testing at NIMRIC net.
Oh, I'm asking the question. I don't know, because I mean, Part 5 already has the mobile test break site language, so maybe it's better to stay with that.
To say that.
I
Again, it's not
don't-
in the territorial sea.
Yeah, I don't know if Andy, if you have any opinions about that.
If you feel like you want to be specific and consistent with Part 5, I support that, and adding the mobile ocean test birds would be appropriate.
Well, I think that's what's in there right now, so
Yep.
I think we're good.
Why wouldn't all testing at NIMRIC have the same treatment? I mean, whether it's nets with the mobile ocean test bird or sets. This is Rick.
Well, Part 5 calls out the exemptions to a lot of the resource inventory and effects evaluations for the mobile test bird, which I believe ended up being nets.
Correct.
Yep. And then secondly, sets, DSL's land management rules, actually any of the state statutory rules for ocean renewable energy will not apply to sets because it's going to be in the OCS, it's not in the territorial sea. So you'll be under whatever the criteria is for,
Okay, thank you.
And Scott McMullen joined us, thank you.
Sorry for being late.
No problem. Thank you for making the drive down, Michelle, that's if you're interested. Any other questions regarding the two checklists that we handed out at the last meeting?
So, yeah, the question.
Yes, sir. That's Jason.
Jason's. Does the operation plan, checklist, and effects evaluation apply to that testing, demonstration, pilot project? The type we're sort of thinking about here in terms of GAGPs.
I had my Part 5 here just a second ago. I believe it does, but for pilot projects, I think there are some things that are not needed, especially on the development plans. And I can look at it real quickly.
Yeah, if you look on page, looks like 13 of 55 for the territorial sea plan, footnote 17, says that pilot projects that are authorized under the standards and conditions of the subparagraph F2 are not required to fulfill the requirements of Section D. Section D is where it's the operations plan development.
Yes.
So
So there's a couple ways we can handle that, Jason. Certainly, I still plan to have a pre-application process. Good morning, Anna.
Good morning, sorry I'm late.
No problem. Grab a seat. Gentlemen, if you want. Anna Houston just joined us.
I'll sit.
So a couple ways we can handle is obviously provide directions through that pre-application process about what's required. But would you like to see in the box on here about so this is a pilot project, demonstration project, and maybe we could highlight some things that do not either need to be completed or don't. I mean, we have the non-applicable box on this checklist for everything.
I guess what I was sort of thinking about when I saw this was the types of projects that it would apply to. Would pilot projects more or less capture all of the temporary, low impact, what we were kind of referred to as, at least I did, sort of testing and demonstration type projects? Does that capture pilot project capture all of these things that we're talking about? That would possibly qualify for a GAGP? Is that
I think where we're leaning towards, one of the discussions we've had so far with regards to the regulatory permitting, would be pilot project, research projects, possibly, and we haven't come to consensus on what's going to be, what that permit is going to look like. I would think those are the type of things we'd be looking at developing a general permit for. A regulatory permit, and of course, as for the proprietary lease, it would be a temporary use authorization as a demonstration project, right?
Both of which constitute a pilot project. They are pilot projects. I guess I need to go back and do my homework to try to remind myself the definitions of the types of categories that we have here, but I'm just kind of hoping that someone might just have the answer. So when we say pilot project, are we capturing testing, demonstration, temporary projects that have sort of low potential effect on the environment? I mean, the kind of category of things that we're talking about, is that pilot project captures that collection of projects?
Yes, going back to part 5, I believe that pilot project was defined as a demonstration project under DSL's ocean renewable energy rules. So I can find that definition for you. Limited duration, non-commercial activity. So limited duration, non-commercial testing of a device, installation of device over state-owned lands to test the economic and/or technological viability of establishing a commercial operation, and may be temporarily connected to the grid. Thank you.
We have 3 categories then, right? So we've got research, demonstration, and commercial. But
Yes.
we're saying pilot and demonstration
They're the same thing. Yep.
and they're appointed to mean the same thing.
Mm-hmm. So in my world, I'm used to calling it a demonstration project. I've just started calling it a pilot, but actually fine in your world.
We're all
Pilot.
you maybe agree that I'll stop saying testing and demonstration, but it's a pilot project, right?
Yes.
So we're talking about, basically this whole group is here to talk about pilot projects.
Well, and the rulemaking for, we're going to look at all the different projects here, both regulatory and proprietary rulemaking. So we're going to look at these, amending the rules for the establishment of a long-term commercial lease. I don't think we're going to need to change much for the section on a university, Cal Poly, or OSU testing a research device, but so I think we're looking at both. But I think I think where most people are kind of going to have the most discussion and concerns are going to be about pilot projects and what sort of the regulatory permitting regime, what that's going to look like.
Chris, can I just take a pause for a second? You said you consider these demonstration projects. If that wording is more consistent with your world, should we deal with the fact that when we say pilot, you think demonstration?
They're the same.
They're literally the same. Yeah.
Pilot comes from part 5, though. That's the challenge, right?
It does, yeah.
And demonstration
Give me 1 second.
is defined under statute. Okay.
Well, so Otto is next, and
that's right.
if somebody can help with this.
May the record show my tense is up.
That's not a good one.
Well, I know I'm repetitive in what I'm about to say, which was what the theme of some of my remarks in the previous two meetings was, as we define demo and pilot, the more short term, the more limited in scale, the more a site has had a lot of advanced vetting, like a PMAC or something like that. With that, and that's where some kind of accelerated general authorization type thing, I think some people at the community level would feel comfortable with that. And so maybe we really are needing to, so if indeed there's an appetite to that people are agreeing, there's a certain amount of agreement on that, and then maybe the focal point could be on the definitions then. Because you're right, with the jargon, maybe what someone's saying is demo is somebody else's pilot, and then we just later on realize, well, I thought the demo would have been something like this. I think that would be helpful potentially.
Right, and so what's open right now is the rule. We could somehow we can connect, what's open right now is the Department of State Lands rule.
Right.
Somehow connect or even change demonstration project to pilot project, because it's the same, they're one and the same with the pilot and Part 5. The strange thing is that Part 5 refers to, literally by word, refers to the definition of demonstration project in the DSL rules, including the rule citation. So it's sort of a chicken and egg thing. I think we can do it. We can just change it to say pilot.
There's no factor in terms of DLCDs, OARs that would prohibit us from putting meat on the bone about what we mean by that, because it's even referring back to DSLs, OARs, or statutes to define.
It is. If we start fiddling with the definition too much, though, I think Part 5 relied pretty much on the wording of what a demonstration project was. I was thinking we could marry the two names up pretty easily, though. Andy, your thought?
Yeah, and I guess I would prefer not to change the terminology that's there, given that the demonstration project is already defined, it has a concept. Part 5 ties directly to that, it references it. So I'm curious to know why we see the need to change the terminology, given that we do have it.
I'm trying to operationalize the idea that if there was some near consensus here that smaller, temporary, vetted projects should enjoy that kind of accelerate, because for the reasons I think we all agree, those are the kinds of things, like when general authorizations are used in other things, they're substantially the same, they're de minimis in nature, they don't deserve a full-blown permit process. I think we all get it, that there's some research projects that we all, especially at things like OSU's facility, et cetera, that, let them go. We want them to go. We shouldn't drag them through the potential, well, it's a pejorative to say drag them through. We shouldn't need to have them go through yet what would then become a duplicative process. But when you have demonstration projects that could be there for decades that are really quite big and have a lot of impacts on people, I don't think those things should be subject to this accelerated permit. Mm-hmm. And I doubt that a lot of people at the community level would be budged from that basic thing. And then so, look, if we disagree and we need to, at the end of the day, there's a minority report that says that this is kind of landlord what we really think should happen, then we can go that, and that's not a threat. That's just like, this is capturing the essence of these two different worlds and it's trying to be constructive.
Sure. And we have time to discuss that. I think we're going to have more discussion about the general permits, general authorization, and the removal fill rules. The full-blown removal fill rule moving forward. Just back to this agenda item, I think Jason's initial question was about the two checklists which we were following up on from last meeting. And we noted that projects at NIMRIC don't have to fill out everything on the effects evaluation checklist or the operation plan development checklist.
And that's accepted by the territorial sea plan. We're not touching that, so that's just we're done, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So you pointed out that pilot projects, as defined, also don't have to do everything on both these two checklists.
Yeah.
And the question is, you want to highlight or ask them to make notes of that.
Make sure everybody was aware that, I mean, I did not know until I was actually going reading this thing for the first time in a couple of years. There it is. It doesn't apply for pilot projects. So.
Well, it's an easy fix. I can bring a draft of these checklist backs with sort of with some of those X'd out or they're indicated that they're just not good. It's already not applicable via being a pilot project. It's not everything, but we can go through that.
So Chris, you feel like someone walks in the door and you know what a pilot project is, right, as you're processing the permit?
Well, it'll have to meet the definition. Yeah. But they'll be at the original, they'll be hopefully at the initial phase when they come in for the pre-application process.
Yeah.
Not and then these checklists will be submitted with their application when they're ready to go. So hopefully we can guide them based on their preliminary discussion with us through the pre-application process with regards to, okay, your project will be a pilot project. You need to submit this application. You have to submit this application fee. Here are our 2 supplemental checklists, inventories you need to complete. And as Delia was saying when we started, you might be able to use this site or find this information to help you with parts of the checklist. And the group that helps in the pre-application process will also be able to say, this is probably not applicable, this is probably not applicable. And conversely, if we've all sort of agreed this is a pilot project, we can tell them at that time that, by the way, these aren't applicable per Part 5. So that's the way I would probably handle it instead of altering the checklist right now. But as Jason correctly pointed out, pilot projects under Part 5 don't need to do everything in these checklists, and we could put an asterisk by some of these that if it did qualify as a pilot project, it's when some of these items on the checklist will be not applicable. Do you want us to try to do that?
I mean, it helps if it clarifies anything, just makes it clearer. That's fine. It is too much trouble to know.
It'll be a good exercise for me, so I'll tell you what, I'll do it for the next meeting, and then we can decide if we want to keep it or not. So it'll get me familiar with those things that they don't have to do, folks have to do. Walter, and then Charlie, I think.
So it's just a quick, more process question. So you have a pilot project, and then you put in for a general application. Would they then have to go through the more rigorous checklist, or would they be grandfathered in under a pilot project?
So Walter, your question is that they've applied for a pilot project?
They started as a pilot project, and then they want to go for the general authorization and do a build out from there.
A commercial build out?
Yes.
Yeah, I think at that point they would submit a new application for a lease as opposed to a temporary use authorization, in which case it would be new pre-app, the whole thing, new pre-app, new application with probably a larger application fee, new JARs, and the checklist, a new evaluation, a new checklist required, and then a new evaluation of the materials that they've provided.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. As opposed to just an amendment where it's like, I would not expect that to be an amendment that's just handled between the department and the holder. They'd be a holder maybe at this time, just administrative. I think you have to reapply for that.
Thanks, Chris.
Charlie and then Jason. That's all right, Jerry.
Okay, I'm trying to catch up, and I apologize. I was gone at the last meeting. This pilot concept versus full build out checklist inventory, is there going to be a separate checklist then for pilot or demonstration projects as we're talking now?
So I think Charlie, these are the 2 checklists we anticipated coming up with. They cover all of there's a box for all the framework in sections B and D of Part 5, which the Department of State Lands is responsible for implementing. The question would be when they come in and they do the pre-app meeting, we discuss what the appropriate authorization is with the department, with our sister agencies, with other affected stakeholders. We'll help them work through the checklist as to what may or may not be needed, needs to be included when they submit their full application. Does that help? Or do you think there's a second checklist?
No, I guess I guess it doesn't seem clear to me then, if I was doing a pilot project, what on this list applies to me and what doesn't apply to me. And it sounds like what you're saying is that the chart or the pre-application process determines that, which I would just think that there would be some, that just seems kind of subjective.
Sure. So that kind of goes to one of Jason's points with regards to maybe just highlighting what won't be needed for a pilot project.
Some aspect of a checklist would be necessary in order to demonstrate that you qualify for being a pilot project, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to have to talk about some of the stuff in the checklist.
Okay. And frankly, it's going to, I mean, depending, I don't know what the project may look like, what its footprint might be, and what its duration might be. So when they come in that pre-application process, it would be my expectation we would help guide them through what we think they need to submit to be a complete application. So some of it will be subjective, but not just with one person in the room. The pre-application meeting is a larger group, and will include DLC and other agencies at least.
Okay. Other questions? These are kind of maybe stupid, and I apologize. When we say meteorological conditions, are we talking about the weather? Sorry, just a yes. Is that what we're talking about?
I want to look at the exact context that you're referring to, but I would
Looking
say
at the
yes.
I'm looking at the checklist.
Yeah.
Okay. We're confused about what it means, and the applicant's going to be confused, so we should be clear. There's just a few things that seem quite general here, and I don't know if they, we reference marine map in the preamble, which has its own thing, and I realize we're going to go to a new inventory. But I don't know how tightly these things align with how we define and describe them in marine maps. So again, as a potential applicant, not me myself, but if in that position, I would think, should these align well with what we have in marine map or in our inventory defined, and then what's going to be required maybe beyond the existing resource inventory.
I appreciate your taking that context, and you know what? We want to use plain language as much as possible. For the checklist, we sort of just literally took the criteria as they were described in Part 5 and put them over here as things we would that need to be considered or not. That if we need to flush those things out so it makes sense, this is the time and place to do it. Not with this group, but taking these comments back, since I'm going to take a look at the checklist anyway, and confirm such as meteorological means what's the weather like out there, or.
And I wouldn't think marine map would be your resource for that in that example, kind of to Telia's point before, like where would you find this information? Again, water quality, it's pretty general. I don't know what that means. I also mean, that's probably limited in our inventory, so I picked that one out. I would need the agencies to talk to the ecology and the habitat stuff. One of the other things that popped out was in the other checklist, the operations plan. Down under the financial assurance plan, this just doesn't kind of make sense to me. Excluding the cost of removing anchors, cables, or any other equipment that is not required to be removed from beneath the submerged lands.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure what that means. Are there some projects where we don't require removal after they're over?
Yeah.
And I'd like to know what those are and what they look like, or how that's defined elsewhere. But yeah, it kind of says like, demonstrate the cost for your post-closure removal, except for the stuff you're not required to do. Mm-hmm. Which I guess you could say about every category. So I don't know, it's a little confusing.
Perfect. Thank you. No, that's good. We'll look at this with a different lens back at the office and try to flush some of these out. And we'll talk more about decommissioning a little later. The answer is yes. In statute, you're allowed to leave certain types of materials that are buried more than a meter below the surface. But we can talk more about that later.
Yeah, I just get a refresher on the statute.
And these are great. I'm glad Jerry's here. I don't know if you met Jerry Hudson. She's our proprietary coordinator for the South Coast. We're not going to do a lot of these. We don't do these very often. So our land managers who mostly deal with Walter and leases in the bays and estuaries and rivers are going to be relying on our experts from other agencies and other stakeholders to help with the charge. Tell us what they think is we need to see to deem one of these complete and then move forward with a project. So I think it was Jason, and then was it Otto, and then Hugh.
Just a couple things. One, Charlie, regarding your question there, two things. One, the operations plan wouldn't apply to a pilot project. Some elements we may end up applying. It's clear that some aspect of it has to apply because we need to define what the project looks like at some basic level so we can determine whether or not it qualifies for this GAGP thing. And by the way, the statute, Senate Bill 606, allows the leaving of certain things, a cable, for example, if you're decommissioning a commercial project and it's buried below a certain depth. I think it was 2 meters.
I think it's 1 meter.
1 meter. We figured, and it gives DSL some discretion. It's like, look, it's going to cause more harm to remove it than just decommissioning it in place. And then you have the authority to decommission it in place. Same way with if you installed an anchor that was one of the suction bed that kind of works its way down to the sand, and several feet underneath the sand, you leave it there, as opposed to or chop it off below the surface. So those are kind of things that I think the legislature was anticipating when they made an allowance for decommissioning in place under certain circumstances. But the reason I raised my flag was because I think of Walter's question about whether you can move from a pilot and get to do a commercial something. I want to be clear that it's my opinion that the legislature did this, and the language that created this purpose for this rulemaking advisory committee was pretty clear to me, which was to try to facilitate testing and demonstration, pilot projects. I do not anticipate any kind of free pass for any commercial project based on our work here. The only intent here is to facilitate demonstration projects that have low potential effect to the environment, temporary, low impact kind of projects. In, out. If they want to, they decide the thing is functioning well, and let's hook it up to the grid. Let's create some electricity. Let's turn it into a commercial project. Well, then they get to go through the full Part 5 process. I don't think we should give any free passes just because they get some sort of GA or GP for a pilot project. That's my opinion. That's kind of how I see this. And of course, if you guys want to make it easier on us, I'm all ears.
So let's take a couple more on the checklist, and then we'll move on from there. I'll give a quick update on the general permit rulemaking, the regulatory rulemaking. Otto, and then Hugh.
And I really appreciate what Jason said, and I think there's really a lot of alignment on that. That Walter's question was kind of an easy question, because you wouldn't have that free pass. You wouldn't just, if you do this, you're going to go into that. But Chris, just to harp on my previous point, just to help you do your job later on, as we all get this common understanding of what is in and out and temporary and deserves the accelerated bid versus what's not. So for instance, I'm trying to remember, so often with that OPT project in the Territorial Sea back in the day, the 9 or 10 buoys, it was at least 30 acres.
33. I think it was 33 acres. Yeah.
Well, and it was going to be there for a long time, and it was billed as a demo project, and that's why I lay that out there as not a complete hypothetical. That was a real deal that actually happened, and I'm just looking at you. You don't need to. I'm not trying to force you. Would that have been a pilot, or would that have been how would you have? Do you think would you have treated that kind of scenario?
I'm sorry. Oh, was that OPT's project?
Yeah.
Well, OPT's project was a demonstration project, pilot project for the one buoy, not grid-connected, for authorized use area of 33 acres with a 5-year term. Is that what?
Well, it was one buoy with the idea that, I know you were so involved in that too, it was one buoy with the idea that it was going to go to 10,
Yep.
and then it came back to 9. But see, to me, then, if indeed the one buoy, temporary, it starts to look like the accelerator thing, I think we're all agreeing on. I'm just saying that project, if that's being billed as demo, and you just basically have the accelerator process, I'm not sure that we are on the same page. Because I think that was longer duration, a lot bigger impact, a lot more spatially absorbing, and a lot longer durations. I think that there wasn't this idea that you would, especially with technology that was that expensive and that difficult to deploy, that it was going to come in and out. I mean, it was going to be there, and it was going to have a power purchase agreement and the whole deal. Even the 10.
Correct, the 10 was, and the 10 would have come in for a second for an additional permit application.
10 wasn't an administration project.
No,
That
10
was
was
sort of
just
phase 1 of the commercial project.
All that was authorized with Reedsport OPT with the department was one non-grid connected ocean energy conversion device. But yes, they would have had to come back in. We knew they had a phased development plan. I think we all knew that back then.
Yeah, no, that was real transparent. Yeah.
But yeah, they would have had to come back in with a new application and new review process, and probably a JART, I would guess, for expansion to the 10 with a grid connection. That wasn't part of the authorization that I think we just terminated, or is it done? Okay.
For us.
Hugh, and then let's finish this up.
Okay, quickly, and I think maybe we'll get into this in the next discussion a little bit. But on the inventory checklist, should there be a place, in keeping with Charlie's theme on keeping this simple and understandable, we have this issue with OPT and others that talked about pilot or demonstration projects off our coast, is what kind of buffer zone is going to be needed, or if a buffer zone is going to be needed. With OPT in the beginning, you can fish right up to the buoy. There's no problem there. And then it was realized with the way the currents are running, where it was located, that we actually needed quite a distance away from the buoy with our gear because of the natural currents and things like that. So maybe if we had something on the checklist up front, knowing whether there was going to be a buffer zone, it could add into their 50 acres or whatever we're going to give them. Is that included in it? Would be another question. So just throw that out there.
Great, thank you.
This is Rick. My antenna's up.
Okay, Rick, last comment. And Joanne, do you have a question or comment too?
I'm just taking it all in. Thanks.
Okay. Captain?
So with regard to the last item on buffer zone, the Coast Guard is looking nationwide at a area to be avoided designation for renewable energy facilities, which means it's not an exclusion zone, it's not a buffer as in a stay out, it's a notification of this is an area to be avoided. As was commented, the calculation of the size of the area to be avoided would need to consider what the mariners and fishermen and crabbers gear and prevailing winds. So, I agree that we need to calculate a buffer, and that will be an input to the navigation safety plan for the area to be avoided.
Great. Thank you. The next one is really quick, I promise, because we don't have much to say about it right now. I want to give you an update on the regulatory rulemaking. As I discussed, obviously Kirk couldn't make it today. We have Mike DeBlasi who's going to be helping out with the removal fill rulemaking as well. He couldn't make it, but Mike has experience permitting short-term demonstration project. He convened the agency's first JART to look at M3 off of Camp Riley yet. So basically they've started the outline of a general permit. Based on our discussion last time, we discussed general authorization, which was sort of a notification-based streamlined regulatory permit, and then the general permit, which is sort of a streamlined individual permit that still has a public comment period and things like that. So right now, back at the office, we're in the process of developing the rule, the streamlined rule as a general permit, and I'll be back here at your September meeting for your review and comment. Why? Because it provides for public review period that many RAC members have indicated is important for transparency. And since the JARC process alone does not accommodate public review. It also allows for the development of project-specific conditions based on the technology proposed and specific site conditions. And that's something that a general authorization does not accommodate, does not allow for site-specific conditions, just it's whatever the general conditions are in rule. And thirdly, this will accommodate the first two considerations. There's only a 10-day difference between the permitting of the two, and then you get the added benefit of a public comment period on the regulatory permit. All that said, if the RAC, after seeing the general permit rule, collectively decides that GA isn't such a bad idea, general authorization, it is relatively easy for us to convert the GP language to a GA rule language. So that's kind of where we are on that. Up on the flip chart, I sort of put that's the rule framework that you'll see for the general permit. It's just still pretty streamlined rule purpose. The criteria for being eligible, some specific application requirements, what activities will be authorized under that, and then the activity-specific conditions, also noting that through that process we do have the ability to impose additional site-specific conditions as needed. So to answer one of Anna's questions, we're still looking at a streamlined regulatory permit. Right now the department is looking at the general permit, not the general authorization.
And the difference between the two again, a GA versus a GP is?
The GA is really like a notification-based permit. It's just if you apply to show that you're eligible for it, and if you are, you get it. There's no public comment period. There's no public review. The general permit is still supposed to be for projects with predictable impacts, but it has your benefit is that you still have some set criteria. You have a shorter public comment period. So it's sort of it's like a light individual permit. But it's not a general authorization, and it allows, general authorization comes with, if you're eligible for it, there's this set of conditions, as opposed to the general permit, which has a set of conditions, specific conditions, but there is the ability through public review and comment to add additional conditions if needed.
So if you laid out the spectrum of the least amount of public involvement and the most sort of, you tell us what it is, just go. We've got a checklist that helps persuade you this is really in and out with minimal impact on anybody else. Let it rip. So that's one end of the spectrum. So it's like...
It's in the middle.
That's in the middle.
The GP is sort of in the middle.
Okay. So GA is the quickest and easiest.
Yep.
And then what's the next, as we work the spectrum?
Yeah, there's just the three. It's the general authorization.
Okay.
The general permits, which is what we're looking at developing for pilot projects, demonstration project, pilot project.
Right.
And then the individual permit. Individual means
the regular.
You're looking at it's the full meal deal. Yeah. And that would be certainly that might be for certain pilot projects, but it also certainly be for any commercial build-outs.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I was
Jason.
Jason, so I was thinking about a extra comment. I was researching general authorizations and general permits recently, and your comment was that the GA does not allow the Department of State Lands to apply site-specific conditions on a project. You only allow these initial set of conditions that would apply to every GA. But in fact, it does allow, and it calls out, it states that statute 196-850 in your OARs, it makes reference to this statute saying this applies. And under that it says 196-850, the department shall condition any general authorization upon action necessary to minimize environmental effects or environmental impacts. Does that not give DSL the authority to apply conditions to that project?
Well, I'll have to defer to Kirk when he gets here, but I think those are still developed through the rule process as opposed to being imposed on the actual individual project as they come in. And I'm looking at the rules that have been developed for general authorizations right now as opposed to the general permits, which I see in the general permit conditions, general conditions that they seem to always have one at the end that says additional conditions. The department may impose additional conditions if necessary, etc. And looking at the general authorizations, activity-specific conditions, I don't see the same sort of additional conditions language. But Sabrina's writing her note down, and we will have, I anticipate most of the next meeting to be a regulatory basis.
So to add to that, so I'm sympathetic to the idea that the GA provides no opportunity for any kind of public review or no insight whatsoever other than just a basic document you hand over and say, okay, you're qualified to go forward. I get it, but it does, my notes say that OAR Rule 14189-0625, section 4, also requires that GAs are made pursuant to the requirements of ORS 196-850. 196-850 in turn, among other things, requires that DSL condition any general authorization upon actions necessary to minimize environmental impacts. That DSL, these are quotes, shall provide notice of any proposed general authorization to affected federal, state agencies, local governments, tribal governments, and the public. And that DSL shall, quote, amend or rescind any general authorization upon determination that the activities conducted under the authorization have resulted in or would result in more than minimal environmental impacts or long-term harm to the water resources of the state. So it's my reading, I was thinking this would give us the types of restraints that we would want to see for any kind of process, a project that we want in the water. Public comment, agency input, minimize impacts, and an opportunity to pull things out or reject it if it's going to cause anything more than minimal impacts.
Okay. I think certainly. I think it's more of a notification than a soliciting comment. I can let Kirk speak to it more. And yes, and we can certainly revoke it if it ends up not meeting the eligibility requirements of the GA. But yeah, that'll be something we can discuss.
Doing our part to keep the GA on the table until we determine that it simply isn't appropriate.
I still don't think the time is going to be a big issue with the public review period or timing of a GP versus a GA is going to be a big issue for any project that's going to require a proprietary authorization, because if we're convening a JART, then it's going to take longer than 10 days. Certainly it's going to take more long than that 60, 90 days to actually complete something. So there's time for a public comment review period. The only exception would be something that tests at NIMRIC nets, because it has so many exemptions already under Part 5, including the convening of JART. So there may be something there. That's only, this is me, and I'm not in the regulatory program. That'd be the one place I could see maybe a GA if something was needed. For some, really kind of fitting would be for something at NIMRIC nets, because you might already have a very streamlined, quick process, because we've already, through Part 5, said things can test there with, it already has quite a few exemptions under Part 5. I'll do my best to answer any more questions on that update, but I'm not the regulatory guy. Captain or Joanne, do you have any questions on the phone or comments?
Now that checklist that you guys are referring to, that you and DLCD came up with, did you email that out to the group or?
Yes, the two checklists. I will follow up. They were actually part of the July agenda, and they were in the July packets. There was some homework. We didn't get to everything on the July.
Okay. All right, good enough. I got it.
They're in there.
This is Rick. If we're going to be doing testing at Camp Rylea with Oregon State involved for our MOU, it would be nice to consider that in the process. The intent is that Camp Rylea could provide the NIMRIC shallow and mid-depth test opportunities that they can do down at SES.
Captain, I hear you. I don't, under part 5, I did not get the sort of exemption treatment that NIMRIC did. Is that right?
I can always try. Thank you.
Thank you. How are we doing? Just want to check in with everyone. Doing good? Do you need a break? No? Okay. Donut. Yeah.
The donut's incredible. I haven't had something like this in a number of weeks. I've been watching my weight. This is like insanely good.
Okay, good.
I'm having an out-of-body experience over here.
That wasn't a special donut.
Right?
Yeah. Well, that was
An Oregon special donut.
I almost feel like I should have had public notice for this, right?
So one of the things we discussed a lot at the July meeting was one of the parking lot issues from the first meeting, and that was the disconnect of a first right to apply when just deploying scientific research, and how if it may be appropriate to tie that in to this process, or if not. I thought about it a little more and came up with a short memo for you guys to consider that should be in your packets and was emailed with regards to first right to apply when somebody is spending time and resources testing the conditions for economic viability. And just kind of wanted to go through that quickly with you, see if you want to have a quick discussion about this. There's also something pointed out by Lincoln County's legal assistants when they were still here. They must have gone back to Bureau now.
They're back on campus getting ready for their second year.
They noticed that our existing rules do have a first right to apply for somebody who's engaged in a demonstrate pilot project to apply, have first right to apply for an ocean energy lease, but then there's nothing in the rules about what exactly that means. So I tried to take a stab at making a connection between spending time and financial resources and testing the economic viability of an area, so that somebody would have the first right to apply after they've done that work for a pilot project, not for an ocean energy, not for a lease, not make a jump to a lease, but that would allow them to test a device as a pilot project, and then that would tie into what's already pre-existing, the first right to apply from a pilot project to an ocean energy lease. With some sideboards, one that they end up being a holder in good standing, and that made me think about some of the other holders we've had in the past. So I'm hoping that I would also keep applicants and holders on their best behavior to keep their first right to apply in place. So I sort of wrote up what I thought a good definition for holder in good standing would be. I also thought you want to see.
So do you have that? Did you articulate what a holder in good standing is?
I did on the memo, so I can read it. So I would suggest. So basically, if we take a look at the memo, this is just something for you as consideration with the following sideboard. So allow somebody who spends money, gets a special use license to deploy acoustic Doppler profilers. So they would have the first right to test a device as a pilot, and then from there they would have, if they had successful test of a device, then they would have the first right to apply for an ocean energy lease. So there's sort of that continuity and predictability for industry. So my sideboards for consideration were, this is all just for consideration, guys, ladies and gentlemen. First right to apply be limited to a holder in good standing. That was not defined, so below was a possible definition. Holder in good standing is a holder of an authorization by the department that is not currently in default or non-compliance with any proprietary or regulatory authorization that's been issued by the department. Also thought we want to see a limit to the size that a first right to apply would be allowed for. And maybe a limit on how many special use licenses for testing acoustic Doppler profilers this entity might be able to put out. It's not the first right to apply. is, as you might remember, we had the aqua marine discussion with the sort of a shotgun approach over a few counties and putting out acoustic profilers and wanting to get first right to apply to all those areas. That's something I would think that stakeholders would not look well upon. We can discuss that. So basically here I just said it would be a person or a holder would be limited to one first right to apply at any given time. And that there is no first right to apply for scientific data collection for an educational institution who has a research project. Because clearly if they are authorizations of research project, they don't have any intention to move forward as a commercial operation, so that shouldn't be a problem for them since they're not a business. And then I took a stab at what a first right to apply would actually, what it means. And this is sort of from a preference right language that's in state statute for an upland owner having a preference right to lease the waterway adjacent to their upland. So I sort of mirrored it off of that. And I'm not going to read all of that on it because that's paragraphs. But I'd be happy to sort of entertain any questions, or I'd love to hear your input on additional input on this topic, so we can take it back.
Yeah, hi Chris. This is Joanne. I think my test up. I think it's a great. I think it's a good proposal that you have here for first right of refusal. And the one thing that I was lured to, because I have to do these kind of things also with my ideas. My only question was, why would you be giving them 120 days after you give them initially the 30 days? I would recommend 30, and I would recommend 30 days after down on C. Mm-hmm. I would recommend that be 30 days as well. That's my only comment. Everything else, awesome.
Joanne, I actually highlighted that, so thank you for noting that. That is the language from our waterway leasing rules. That is a pretty long window if somebody is still lock up a first right.
Well, I'll tell you what, those rules probably need to be reviewed too, Chris. For the water.
And Jason,
30 days, I would say. No more.
I think Hugh, Delia, Scott, Jason.
Thank you. First of all, I see first right to apply is limited to an area of 50 acres. I know this is all up for discussion. Maybe a better wording of that would be not to exceed 50 acres. So if we just give everybody 50 acres, they're going to take 50 acres. Whereas OPT only needed 33. Let's let them apply for what they think, but not to an exceed amount.
Yeah, that's a good comment. Up to.
Also, I'm kind of wondering about the scientific data collection, whether that's a loophole that some companies, example, OPT might put some military device on for Lockheed Martin while it's out there, a sonar or something, and call it scientific data collection and be able to have a loophole by doing that, or finding some scientific equipment they can put on it. We're probably going to have, who knows, solar panels, all different kinds of things that they may be testing out for that particular device. Just wondering if we've thought about that carefully enough.
Okay.
And under where it says first right to apply for an ocean energy facility lease from a demonstration project, I think in the the second sentence where it says, well, it reads, a holder in good standing of a temporary use authorization to conduct a demonstration project shall be given a first right to apply. Shall and may are very important in legal terms, as most people know. I think personally it should say may be given the first right to apply for an ocean renewable energy lease if they meet all of the conditions below. That way you're saying we have the right to refuse, but if you say they shall be given the first right to apply, and I don't see where it morphs into saying if they meet these conditions. It just says shall be given the first right to apply for an ocean renewable energy facility lease or the authorization area specified in the temporary use authorization, period. It doesn't say if you meet these underneath it. I don't know if that's legal problem or not, but I've known personally where people have lost a lot of money because there was a shall in there and not a may.
Okay. Thank you. Gilly?
So I had a comment on the area description too. I think 50 acres could mean a very different spatial extent based on whether or not you're considering a project boundary or a footprint, because footprint, which is used for the regulatory branch assessment, would just be the footprint of the anchors or anything else on the seafloor. Collectively, that could be quite extensive. And so for other users and resource concerns, I think it's important to have that constrained to 50 acres within the project boundary being the greatest extent. So, and then I was just hoping that you could kind of go through in the agenda you laid out special use license, and then there's an arrow, pilot demonstration project, and then an arrow, commercial lease. And I was just getting a little confused between, so I'm a developer, I go out and I conduct my investigation or my site evaluation before I've applied for anything, right? To DSL. So in that case, I haven't applied to anything, so DSL can't offer me anything. So I'm confused by the sequence. Could you just go through the sequence?
Sure. So hopefully a developer, maybe they're doing a desk analysis prior to putting things in the water, but if they are putting devices in the water in the territorial sea, they should be getting an authorization from the department to do that. In this case, it would be it would be a special use license or lease under our special use rules for a scientific research project.
Under 125 or 140?
Under Division 125, yeah. So the next, I'm sure there's lots of modeling, and there's, like I said, maps and charts and desk analysis can be done, but when they actually decide they're going to look at the site and start deploying instrumentation to collect information, they should be getting some sort of authorization from the department. With the arrows here, so that would be the special use license, which is what we told Aquamarine they needed to get when they wanted to put acoustic Doppler current profilers out. The complaint was there wasn't any connection, there wasn't any incentive for them or assurances that if they found something, they would have a first right to move forward at that site, and that maybe their information would get taken, someone else would jump in and apply for something. So once something's deployed, they should have some sort of authorization. We're still looking at it being a special use license for research project, because they're not actually putting an ocean energy conversion device out yet, and that's what comes under 140, and that's what comes under Part 5. So that's the first part, special use license. And if they continue to be, so through this proposal, if they were a holder in good standing, they collected their information, did their ground truthing due diligence, and they wanted to apply to test an ocean energy conversion device as a pilot project at that point, then we would give them first right to do that.
For the temporary use authorization?
Yes. Okay. Yes. And then from there, hopefully there's quite a bit of relationship building. They continue to be a holder in good standing. If they say this is the spot, then they'll have some sort of assurance that they've got the first right to apply for the ocean energy lease. But as opposed to Aquamarine and the request we got from them, they wanted to be able to go. We don't currently have a connection between special use license and first right to apply. So they wanted that, and they wanted it to go to an ocean energy, to have first right to apply for an ocean energy lease. At least I think they did.
Facility lease.
Yes, a lease for a commercial operation. And this proposal in front of you doesn't give you that. It just gives you the first right for them. Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Which I hope would provide some sort of certainty for that investment in the community. And hopefully, with it taking those phased development steps, that will provide the process that I think Oregon wanted when they developed Part 5, and hopefully they'll the relationship with coastal stakeholders if somebody was going to move towards a commercial rollout.
Chris, this is Rick.
Well, can I put you in line, Rick?
Sure.
Okay, we got Rick in line. Scott's next. Thank you, Rick.
I understand that our discussion right now concerns this first right to apply, but I think we have an opportunity to make some improvement here in this rulemaking, which probably ought to be considered, in my view, across the spectrum of DSL's permitting of scientific instruments, including those that have nothing to do with ocean renewable energy. And that is that a first step before placement ought to be consultation with the local stakeholders, because we have often have found scientific instruments been put in a place that interfered with fishing operations, and often could be easily adjusted to a place that doesn't interfere just by collaboration with the fleet. So I think there should be some collaboration with the fleet as part of local stakeholders as part of this. And secondly, that a requirement should be put on by the state that at the end of the term, that all of the equipment come out, including any anchors, anything, so we don't have a situation we had before where railroad wheels are abandoned on the seabed. And like I say, I think this should go beyond just this rulemaking, but this is a chance when we're talking about it. That could be included in what an applicant in good standing would include, conditions that would relate to those things.
Let me just respond to that really quickly. At the last meeting, we went over all of our, you notice I didn't include a short-term access authorization, which we have typically issued some of those through our special use rules in the past. Certainly not for first right of refusal. We've gone to the special use license at least. I think that's a good point. And based on sort of some recent conversations we've had and making sure we are consistent with Part 2 of the Territorial Sea Plan, making resource decisions. I'll say that I hear your comment, and I think we probably for deployment of scientific instruments in the Territorial Sea be looking at special use licenses more often in that Part 2 checklist. And those special use licenses do have a public review and comment period as well. And the decommissioning, we can take a look at that as well. I still think it's important to have short-term access authorizations available for some sort of surveying work, for some sort of grabs for sediment sampling and things like that. But I hear your concerns, especially with anything that could be in that's a little larger and could be in for an extended period of time. Jason.
I think Jeff was next, but
No, you're
Jason and then Walter.
Jerry's running the ship here. She's keeping.
all right.
Speak up.
So the OPT 33 acres was for their 10 buoy project?
Jason, I believe that was what they were going to apply for. Yes, but they had their project area, as Delia pointed out in sort of our discussion here earlier, with the project where it was 33 acres. That's what their initial demonstration project was for. Project Boundary.
Yeah, I was just sort of curious, just trying to get a sort of something to be relative to when we're talking about what kind of acreage we may limit this to. So to be clear, the intent here is to protect the investment that a company would make in deploying ADCP or some other device that's just temporarily deployed to figure out whether or not there was an adequate resource there. So from their perspective, of course, all they're concerned with is that they figured out it's good resource and there's nothing else in there sort of due diligence during that period that's a deal killer that they'd have the authority to move forward. So, while at the same time, we want to avoid site making, right? We don't want to allow companies to sort of tie stuff up. I'm sort of thinking out loud. I'm going to ask some questions to make sure I understand correctly. So once if they did deploy an ADCP and said, this works, and they would want a first right to apply for in this case, what you're proposing is only a pilot project, not a commercial. We can't jump to a commercial project. So it would have to be a pilot project.
That's correct. That's what.
Or phase one of a commercial project. I'm asking, if I was a company, I'd be like, well, no, I've already deployed my devices in the water and Hawaii. It produces electricity. It's working great. We want to deploy it here and connect it to the grid, maybe 2 more while we're at it. Once we figured out that the resource is appropriate, we haven't figured out anything. We've done our due diligence.
Sure.
So we want to put 3 in the water and connect it to the grid.
Sure. So I think there's nothing that prohibits someone from just coming into Oregon and applying for an ocean energy conversion lease. The way this is set up just means you wouldn't get first right to apply. So, which I thought was a concern for the industry, for some sort of certainty for testing. That's all. And I thought that this aligned with what we saw in the territorial sea plan, that if we were going to have some sort of preference right or right to apply, that it would be in sort of the steps approach, the phase development approach. But no, it's not going to the rules aren't going to say that you can't apply. I don't think Part 5 says you can't come in and just apply for an ocean energy lease. And I don't think that these rules won't say that either. You'll be able to still just come in and apply, but it'll be evaluated accordingly.
I don't think about that some more. So, I had 2 or 3 comments here. So 30 days. So you're saying you got 30 days from if someone else says, hey, we're interested in that site as well, you're going to ping the developer and say, hey, there's been someone else who's interested. You have 30 days to submit a pre-application. And would that pre-application be, and I don't know what that looks like, so is that a serious document that requires site studies and environmental data, or is that just a piece of paper that says, hey, we're interested in doing a project here, we want to lock it up?
So that's still to be developed in the rule as a more formal pre-application process for these. But yeah, the pre-application process is going to be a general project description, is my thought, which would kick off the pre-application process that's required, where we bring in the stakeholders and start going over what an application would look like, including the checklists.
Yeah, well, so I think you see where I'm going with that. If they get a notice one day, like they just deployed ADCP and some other company swoops and says, hey, they're interested in that site, so we're interested in that site, you're going to expect that company to be able to put together essentially a complete pre-application in 30 days, which I question whether that's viable. I don't actually know. So that's one issue I would have. And I had the same question about that Joanne did. You had 30 days to submit, or 120 if it's incomplete, which I know what I would do. I would sign my name on the bottom and hand it to you and say, oh, that's incomplete. I'm like, great, I got 120 days to finish up. So maybe you turn that on its head or something. Give them 60 days or 90 days or 120 to do the initial application, and then a shorter period of time for completeness. Because I don't see what for me, I don't see any kind of boogeyman in this in terms of how it can be abused or do something that's counter to public interest. I'm just thinking about it in terms of how do you give the company the certainty it wants if it's going to make the investment to deploy here and plan for a real project. And we're talking about millions of bucks here.
And that's a great comment. I appreciate it. We'll take a look at that.
Walter, Rick, and then Delia.
All right. Walter, Rick, and then Delia.
All right, so what I don't see here, and I don't know if this is going to be spelled out, but would this apply to anywhere in the territorial sea? Or is this just in areas that have been deemed okay for commercial property built out? The rest is, or does it apply to everywhere? Because I can see this as a prospecting, and then all of a sudden they become a member in good standing, and then they're right in the middle of, say, Auckland, and now they want to put in a project where it was deemed not suitable. So I think that there needs to be maybe some language what the intent of these devices are, whether it's for collecting scientific data for pure science, or if they're prospecting for areas where they might want to put in a device.
Yeah, I agree, Walter, and that might have gone with Hugh's comments earlier too, is that what that special use license is authorizing needs to be clear that they're testing for their project is to test the conditions for possible commercial development of ocean energy, or at least to test an ocean energy conversion device later. So I'll have to think about that. I understand your.
Yeah, and my question would be, would that be allowable? I mean, if they're out there in an area where it's not been deemed okay to be, and they're out there testing for wave energy feasibility, I mean, is that something you could give a permit to?
I got to note it. We'll think about it. I don't know if Andy might have a response.
If you want me to respond, I would say that just because they're in a place where they would get a special use license to do research doesn't mean that they wouldn't have to meet the standards associated with Part 5 when they eventually move towards development as a part of the phased approach that we have been discussing. So, only in specific places within our Part 5 framework was there no right to apply. And I think that part of that discussion, if I go back to it, was to say that we don't know what kind of compatibility the devices are going to have with the existing resources and uses. And we didn't want to artificially say no to every place that was a potential, given that we don't know what the technology is going to be. So I think that the approach, the worry that you have with this being a nose under the camel's tent, I don't think is worrisome, because I think they're still going to need to go through, when they work towards the commercial phases of development, that they're going to have to meet those standards that are in Part 5 for the specific geographic areas that we've identified. So those standards within the zones, we developed that graded level of difficulty within, the written effects evaluation and with the resources and uses standards. So they would still have to prove that they could meet those. And I think that's a high bar in certain places and lower in others.
Yeah, my only concern was what Jason brought up is they're investing millions of dollars in these devices, and them coming back and saying, well, look, we've already invested all this money. How can you ask us not to do this again?
Well, I think you got to give them some credit in realizing that they're going to recognize the difficulty in the bars associated with areas of the territorial sea.
Okay.
Thank you, Andy. Captain Rick, I think you're up, and then Delia.
Yeah, it's just a comment about the 33 acres or 50 acres, and like an acre is a fine measurement when your feet are dry, but we don't drive by acres, we drive by nautical miles, and like a tenth of a nautical mile is 85 acres. So, maybe Scott and I can put our heads together and come up with something that's reasonable, because, the precision that you might write into a piece of paper may not be consistent with the accuracy of people operating at sea.
Well said.
I think that would be okay. I would like to make sure, everything kind of, if you have side conversations, that's fine. Just, why don't we you guys want a homework assignment of touching base on that possible side board? Is that what you got?
That's fine with me.
Sure. And Delia, the last word perhaps.
Well, so when I penciled that out, Rick, I thought about that too. So 50 acres is 0.059 square nautical miles. And 1 square nautical mile is 847.5 acres. So just in terms of what we would actually be talking about there, 50 acres is pretty small. So I had a question based on your response to Jason. So when we were talking about the sequence of events here, so you would start with the special use license under 125 and get theoretically first right to apply for a temporary use authorization under 140. And I kind of thought Jason was asking about, so what if you didn't want to go the temporary use route and you just wanted to jump into the commercial lease, also under 140? Then the language that you've proposed here does specify that you would have to go through that sequence. You would have to go through the temporary use authorization. And so if we wanted to start talking about whether or not you would leapfrog around the pilot or demonstration and go into phase 1, that is discussed differently in Part 5. The phased development has some different requirements than a pilot project, so we'd have to consider all of that. And also the expiration time frame that you have proposed here, I was in agreement with, because it had to do with the temporary use authorization. It made sense that if the first right to apply is not exercised within 30 calendar days of the expiration date of the temporary use authorization, then it goes away, it expires. Right, that's what you proposed. And so there needs to be some expiration date, otherwise I'm a developer, I go and I do my work and I maintain my thumbprint on that area for how long. So that expiration date I think is really important. And the 30-day expiration date makes sense for a temporary use authorization, but it might not make sense for a phased development because there's so much more in the planning process that has to do with that. So I want to say, please think very carefully about whether or not the sequence that we're talking about is applicable to a temporary use pilot demonstration, or if we're also going to consider a separate process for a phased development.
Okay, great. I might follow up with you on that.
Okay.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
I think so. Okay, Hugh, and then I want to give...
On that theme,
yes.
Also, we've seen with a lot of these projects, extension after extension after extension with FERC and BOEM and that kind of thing. So maybe while you're rewriting this or whatever you're doing, you can write in something about the amount of extensions they can get on a project, or if there is any. That's up to the rules. So just throwing that out there.
You're going to hate me for this.
Okay, Hanno.
Well,
and that's okay. I want to give Laurel and Justin a chance to just chime in too, since they have, in case they have something. Anything? Okay. Go for it.
Delia made a memorable remark. I think it was at the last meeting, and it was. And now that I've actually, in the last 4 years, actually have had to sort of be in the role of running a department and sort of not just being a policy guy, but working with a lot of the same kind of processes where you have applicants coming to you and stuff. So to the extent that I have some additional insights into that I didn't have just a couple of years ago. When you said, the memorable remark was, at a certain point you got to let the agencies do their job. And that's a very profound comment, because you got to trust the agencies are going to do their job, that there isn't some kind of hidden thumb on the scale from God knows where, that actual considerations from communities are going to matter, or environmental considerations, or what. And so I just want us to pause and think that, I still like the idea that, and it's a prospecting point where, we don't want flunky companies either, that really don't have much of anything. I mean, now I'm putting on, even if I'm trying to promote offshore energy in Oregon, if I have a really relaxed kind of system that I can do, not millions of dollars of research, but some kind of prospecting thing, and now suddenly I've got to write a first refusal that I don't know exactly what even that means. Is it I've got to go ahead and pull together a full application in a certain period of time? The way BOEM does it, and I said this last time, I normally don't like to pull much out of the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act because I think it's a miserable statute that needs to be fundamentally reformed, and it's totally outdated. But they do have the determination of no competitive interest there. And that's how they handle that. If in fact there's a more robust industry where you've got multiple players who want to play in that space and are going to try to access Oregon waters, maybe we should let the agencies do their job, meaning your agency, and let there be a pause and say, hey, who's really interested in this area? And because I think that you know, if you're in the spirit of letting the agencies do their job, if you've got a real player who's investing the money and doing the work, hiring the right people, because that's where, in retrospect, I really felt like, with the benefit of hindsight, when you had companies that were hiring really skilled people, not just going through the motions and spending real money, that, you know, like hiring a firm like yours, you know, that starts to become real, because you got real skill sets and everything in play. I'd like for you to be able to sit there and say, you know what, we'll roll into this determination of or a competitive interest thing, have that pause, let the agency do its job, and say, you know what, these are, you know, that, and I think it would be very persuasive, though, if I'm sitting in your shoes and I'm looking at 2 or 3 people trying to jockey, maybe messing with each other, Jason, right? Because it's like, well, I'll just apply on top of there because I want to hurt my competitor. That happens all the time, that kind of stuff. And if we want to eliminate that, a real player who's hiring the right kind of people, that's putting devices in the water, that is actually looks like it has the wherewithal to carry out a larger project that now starts to really cost money, you're going to know that. Your agency is going to have that, is going to be able to look at that and say, you know what, yeah, these guys are real. Everything about this really passes the straight face test. This is the kind of people we want to do business with. These are the people that are going to be able to carry this forward and be responsible, be in good standing, all that kind of stuff. So I know that's a sprawling kind of statement about, but that's why I'm wondering if we're focusing on things that really, as a practical matter, really don't matter, and that start to become the slippery slope of you get this, now you get this automatic, and you get that. And I don't know, that's even the best thing for promoting the most capable and robust companies that would actually want to do something. Because I think we need to be thinking about this not in this incubation period. We need to be thinking about there is a mature industry, they really want the space, and now they got sharp elbows going after each other. And that's why the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, and our law students figured out when they actually started reading that in the OARs, that all this stuff, you know, that's a mature industry for oil and gas, right? And there are sprawling hundreds of pages of dealing with that, how you deal with that competitive environment, because that's a highly competitive environment where different firms are trying to game the system and outflank each other to get access to the Outer Continental Shelf. So thank you for letting me say that, but I think that's a general comment that resonated with me, and I thank you, Delia, for saying that last thing. I've been thinking about that ever since. I can't get it out of my head what that really means.
Well, thank you. That's another way to look at it. We always appreciate hearing the call. Thank you. Let's take a quick break, and we'll come back and take a look at the JARC structure and process. Sound good? Come back in 10 minutes? It's all the gentlemen.
I kind of wanted to drive home.
Weird.
Yeah, I think so.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
And we're back. Thanks, everybody. I think it's been very productive. I appreciate all your input on this. It's a lot of information. We got a few more memos I'd like to get through and have some discussion as we sort of formulate what the rules will look like for the JARTs and when. I think actually a lot of the JARTs spelled out in Part 5, but I wrote a memo for the last meeting and left it as homework, sort of summarizing the JART composition via Part 5 and the JART's roles and responsibilities as outlined in Part 5. Once again, I think that process was prescriptive as to how the DSL will convene the JART, what it will look like. And basically, I don't think I need to read it word for word, but I wanted to give everyone an opportunity to provide any thoughts on what more needed to be addressed in rule about the JART membership and duties. I also have my own thoughts about how many times the JART may be convened through the proprietary process, the leasing process, the demonstration project process, I can tell you my thoughts were, since we already have an established pre-application process, and as you can probably tell from me talking today, I'm thinking about flushing that pre-application process out a lot more, especially with these checklists being developed. My thought would be to actually convene the JART and the pre-application process so that the applicant gets the benefit of having those folks at the table to start discussing the project and discuss the effects evaluation and operation plan development. And then certainly having them at least meet once more, even once the full application is submitted and the associated documentation of the effects evaluation and the operation plan. That would be, so I'm thinking at least 2 meetings at the JART, pre-application and then a follow-up meeting for pilot projects. And then I think for a commercial build-out, you just have to play it by ear. You know, certainly you have them convene for the pre-app at least once after the application's submitted, and then depending on how substantial that commercial lease application and build-out looks like, you just have to go from there and see how many more meetings may be necessary.
Chris, this is Rick. My tent is up.
Great. You know what? You were the first one with your tent up, so go for it.
It might be helpful before we spin up the full JART to have some kind of pre-screening of an application, like send them to have them attend the joint agency meeting that happens monthly to kind of flush out whether they're real. I mean, we already had one proposal or one core permit that was well-intentioned but misguided, and we were able to intervene and prevent wasting a bunch of people's time on the JART on a faulty permit application. So, getting DSL and maybe the agencies in a normally scheduled meeting like those joint agency ones are to do kind of a sniff test on it, I think would be a good idea.
Thank you, Rick. I think that's a good comment. Maybe you guys recall from one of our earlier meetings, Kirk talking about the Kaizen meetings, which are a joint agency sort of meeting for big projects to come in, usually co-hosted by DSL and the Army Corps of Engineers. I think that would be a good place for someone to come in first. When I'm also talking about flushing out the pre-application process, I'm thinking about there being some sort of pre-application fee as well, and that might be a threshold to test someone's seriousness, especially if we're going to convene a group of experts to meet as well. So there'll be more to come on fees, but something we need to address as we go through the rulemaking process too. And anybody else?
Is the floor open to talk about JART and
Otto, yes, and then Scott, and then Charlie, and then Delia.
Okay.
We got it, yes.
I'd like to have a little more discussion about the selection process. So we've got these basic categories. The number, goes back to the number of people and how people are invited to participate in the JART. That again is going to be up to the discretion of DSL. The one thing that we've learned from, especially the wind flow project, and I think I talked about this last time, that really identifying which stakeholder groups are, and now the stakeholder groups have an MOU with each other that if one of us get approached, then we're all talking. So we're not just having a narrow part of the coast because people fish or have interest coast-wide. So maybe part of the burden is on the communities to participate and make sure that the folks that we have, I'm looking at you right from the source, that we're collaborating and we're sending people to a JART process that we feel know what they're talking about, are not having to start from scratch, and that there's adequate conversation coast-wide about a particular project that's coming in a particular place. So I'm not sure if that's just our job to do that, or making sure that you're aware that we're sensitive to making sure that the right people representing our interests are at the table, that have the kind of street cred and are coordinating properly. I think I'd like to see some language in there, because these things could get very contentious, that minority reports coming out of a JART would be anticipated and authorized, rather than try to have that conversation later about, oh no, we don't like minority reports. I would also like to have an understanding of, let's say we do have disagreements, that that there ought to be a path, and maybe you can just tell me, you'll probably tell me in 2 seconds what that path is, to talk to the land board direct. That if we have some people that have been through a JART process and there's a lease application in front of us, that of course eventually goes to the land board for approval. So if we still have heartburn with what's happened and you've done a minority report to express the concerns, short of having 2 minutes on an agenda with the land board, right? What is that? How do we have a quality interaction and be able to access the land board directly, so any of those concerns there could be a constructive exchange with them as well. So I don't know if I need answers to that right now. Those are the things I'd like to see.
It's something we can consider and try to address in the rule. Right now, none of these actions would necessarily go to the land board because they're not permanent dispositions of the property. But there's always an appeals process under the administrative, you can do an appeals process to the director. We have rules that do both, or you go straight to a contested case hearing as well.
Yeah, because that is something there'll be a real lease application. So, because I hope I'm not blurring the previous discussions we've had about pilot and demo and G and GA and GP. This is now we're talking JART and the makeup of JART and the operations of JART. Right?
Yes.
So yeah, we are talking about potentially major projects that are going forward, and that's why I'm not trying to. That's why maybe the answer is, hey, it's a contested case hearing and this and that, and that's your bite at the apple.
Yeah, under the Administrative Procedures Act. There are actions that do go to the land board for approval that are not permanent dispositions of property. The telecom cables that come across the territorial sea, they're 20-year easements, I believe, and those do go to the land board. I didn't write those rules, but the rest of our term easements don't go to the land board. So a 30-year easement across Uquina Bay, Pacific Power, is just issued by the department administratively. But the cables coming across the territorial sea, which are subject to the specific part of the territorial sea plan, do go to the land board for approval. So it's something we can look at. I don't know. We can even ask their assistants if they want to hear it. But
yeah,
I think maybe you want to make a break. I don't know if you want pilot projects to necessarily have to go. And if I was the industry, I don't know if that might make
right. I thought now we were sort of talking about the JART, how the JART functions, and how some of us see ourselves participating in the JART or others, and that there's enough safeguards and feedback mechanisms listed in there. It's funny you mentioned the cables, because I'm just remembering years ago when I first met Scott, back in the day with the AT&T stuff, that we had, there was some very extensive negotiations that went on right at the last minute with belly up, and by God, this lease was going to go to the land board, and we had some a rapid meeting literally with all the players in DSL at your shop at DSL, where we had a real shucking the corn kind of discussion with AT&T and everybody like that. We actually got it fixed because we knew the land board was going to literally meet in 2 hours, and if we didn't get this figured out, there was going to be this big, coming apart at the seams in front of the land board, and that had a really positive outcome, I think, because we found a way to actually resurrect the deal, Scott, that we had in play, but I don't think anybody wants to literally be cast into a situation like we got the land board's meeting in an hour and a half in the next room, we got to get this figured out. Yeah, it was not an optimal circumstance. I'm not trying to recreate that, but this sort of back and forth and expectation that the land board is going to be involved, I think is a healthy thing. So I'll go off my soapbox. Sure.
But yes, either way, there'll be some sort of an agency decision. There'll be some sort of appeals process, and I'm duly noted about what that may look like. There's something in rule already, but we'll look at that. Scott.
My concern was on JART composition item 4, where it talks about the organizations that are included as invited. And I think when OPAC made the recommendation to the Land Conservation Development Commission, this may have been one area where we were a little weak in our recommendation and didn't take the time to really flesh it out. I know we had a lot on our plate and trying to get it finished, and it seemed to me this is maybe one area where we're a little bit defective. And my read of the intent at the time was that groups that were intimately involved with an area would have a chance to serve on the JART. If something happened again right off Coos Bay, certainly the intent was that source would be the one that would be invited. The wording in this plan doesn't really make that very clear. It just sort of says, if the agency invites somebody, they're on JART. And I think maybe the reason the language is sort of weak is that it would be difficult to write what we intended and what the expectation was. If something was going to happen up off Tillamook, fine, was the obvious group that was expected to be consulted with. But fine here. But I know that was what the intent was. We didn't manage to encapsulate that intent in our recommendation. And so I guess maybe this is a chance that we can at least review it and see if there's a way to maybe better phrase the language, or at least have a common understanding of what the intent was.
I think let Andy chime in, it's his response, and then we'll get to Charlie.
The language that Chris has in his memo, I think is not as detailed as what is in Part 5 currently. And what is in Part 5 currently is very explicit. If you look at item 4 under the JART review process and coordination, sub-bullet A, it says that statewide and local organizations and advisory committees as invited to participate in JART application of specific standards, including but not limited to those addressing areas important to fisheries, ecological resources, recreation, and visual impacts. So I think that language in Part 5 is very explicit, and in coming up with the composition of the JART, we, the state, would work hard to make sure that those local affected groups would be a part of the discussion, part of the deliberations.
I guess the as invited was part of the wording that really caused me a little concern, because I appreciate, I know that with current people in place, I don't have any worry. We're talking about going out 50 years, and we just want to make sure that that intent is there, so that they do get invited. And I guess that's my biggest concern, is that it's not spelled out that they will be invited.
I see your point, but I also see the point that changing people and changing groups, we don't necessarily want to be explicit in this instance, because we don't know that source is going to remain source, fact is going to remain fact. But I mean, we may have different groups on the ground at the time.
You can count on it changing over time.
Right, and therefore, if you make it explicit, then
I don't think that's an appropriate solution.
Yeah.
But I think in the rulemaking we can flush out a little bit, but like somebody said earlier, put some meat on the bones of what was in Part 5 to maybe come up with some example language of what the types of folks we would in a regional area invite to JART. And just like the RAC, you probably don't want the JART to get, it can't be all encompassing, but that doesn't mean just that the project will still go out for public review and comment to all persons or are able to comment. Just like whenever we come up with a draft rule, that will go out for public review and comment and hearings and things like that. Charlie.
I'm kind of reiterating, I think, what Ano and Scott have brought up here, and I don't know if I agree that the language that you just read, Andy, is that specific. I think it encompasses a range of uses and interests. I don't think we can project what all of this are going to be, and I understand kind of the roundness of the statement. But there are pretty, there's a huge range in that and how you could interpret that. I mean, you mentioned advisory committees on there. that could be the entire Ocean Policy Advisory Committee is invited as a stakeholder to one of these JARTs. So it's important how the public interprets like what their representation is, because the agency is going to be held to those expectations. So if one stakeholder or another is not included, I think that there's going to be ramifications for the agency, or at least not goodwill. So I do think we can provide a little more specificity. I'm wondering, what the agencies wouldn't be comfortable with as far as how specific. But things like the Ocean Policy Advisory Council do provide a little bit more specificity as to number of members from an individual stakeholder group or another. So there's, just some thoughts. I don't know.
Yeah.
I can just think, how many JARTs have you convened?
One or two. Who's been up at Camp Bradley? Just M3, or was there a second one? Just one. Just one term.
Okay. And not to pick on that or anything, but I don't know that anybody from the recreational community was engaged in that process. If they were, I didn't know about it. As the individual that represents that group on OPAC, I would want to know that. I think there's also this concern too with source representing an area that is fished by statewide fishermen, and I can see problems if we get too specific like that. And maybe we put some onus back on the stakeholder to represent their group effectively. But I don't know if this is too much for a rule or not. But I do feel like we need a little bit more specificity, because it's just not clear what the selection process is. And then, sorry to be long-winded, last question is the JART subject to public process? Is it subject to one or any or all of the agencies' public process?
You mean things like notice and levels?
Notice, and would the public be invited to these meetings?
I will ask, unless you've already asked. Should Steve?
I haven't.
Okay. I tell you right off the top, I would err on the side of caution. I'm not sure what the answer is to that question. I will find out.
So my comments keep building, so I'll try to keep this short. So as far as membership goes, the JART isn't the first interagency review team that we have. We have a hydropower part. We have the interagency review team that I don't know anything about, but I believe it's DSL's Renewable fill. Is that what it's called? Anyway, and so that's under 141.85, so that's Renewable fill. So there are other groups that meet and have to, deal with these issues. So we're not starting over from scratch with the JART. A couple of things, though, that getting back to your memo, I understand that you copied, I think it was section B3 or B4 from Part 5, and that Part 5 includes some other stuff that wasn't in your memo. But I don't think it was your intent to say that the DSL rules will only apply to this, right?
Right.
Right. So Part 5 will apply. All of the stuff, all the nuance in Part 5 will apply. So, so I just wanted to highlight a couple of things in Part 5 that I think are still very meaningful. One has to do with citing. In Part 5, Section B1A, it says that marine renewable energy must be cited within the areas designated for that use, but it's not really clear what that means.
Okay.
Because we didn't, in the end, actually designate areas. We have FSUs where it's sort of a lower bar, high bar, low bar. But so potentially maybe DSL should clarify what is meant by that and whether the JART would actually inform whether or not citing is appropriate for that use. Is that DSL's call? Is that a JART call? I don't know. You said that you would build something in or that you would recommend building something in for the pre-application process and also for pilot projects. Those are two things that I wanted to highlight. So for the pre-application process, Section B3 leaves it up to the regulating agency. But then in your own rules, it says that the applicant must meet with affected users and so on and so forth. And so finding a way to marry those two, I think, I just agree with that. Pilot projects, I think we've talked a lot about. I don't need to go into that anymore. And then for applying the standards that are spelled out in section B4G, it mentions the JART participation explicitly for aesthetic, but not for fishery, ecological, or recreational. And so I think understanding better about the trying to find an efficient and effective, reasonable and responsible decision-making process where the JART is weighing in on the appropriate things and the DSL is making the decision for the things it needs to make decisions about. I'm just not sure, applying those standards, that seems like something that the JART should have to inform. Does that make sense?
Yes.
For all of those different practices, not just aesthetic. That's it.
I agree. And we're amending our existing rules, so we will marry those up with part 5.
Mr. Bush.
Regarding the participation in JART, and all the comments appreciated. I guess I was operating on the assumption that DSL would, with this, judicious use of this discretion, allow anyone who wanted to participate, any group that wanted to participate in the JART, first there'd be public notice, right? It would be notified, the community would be notified that this project was in process. And any group that wanted to participate in JART would then, within a certain reason, would be allowed to participate. I mean, am I wrong that DSL would not just, if some group showed up and said, Citizens for Keep Our Oceans Blue formed, and they we want to be part of that, and they called you up and said, hey, we'll send our president and a alternative. Can we participate? What would your answer be?
That's a good question. I don't know how effective a group gets if it's just.
Well, again, you have discretion. You have your reasonable discretion to say, look, we're already at 25 people. That's too much. I'm sorry. Or you can sit in the audience and be happy to public comment. So that's probably you wouldn't want to limit this arbitrarily to groups that exist today, or just represent the fishing group, or surf riders, or whatever. Any group that wants to participate should be able to have to say within reason.
I think that's a good comment, yeah, and I think that's probably the way we would lean. I have concerns about the size, and something else that, as we've discussed, is obviously it's moved away from being a joint agency review team and more of a stakeholder review team, which is fine. As you look up and down the coast to Anno's question about who would be sent, obviously if we had something off Lincoln County, somebody from the planning department here, we could be sort of almost an expert on the issues, but if we had one off of Brookings, maybe, and we find a city manager or something, you might, you start from scratch. It'd be great to have sort of a group you could pull from that had experience in it. For example, like ODF&W has Delia, who's an expert on it, and would represent them on a project regardless of where it was on the coast, as opposed to just having a bio, like the regional bio, fish bio, do it from Charleston or somewhere else. I don't know how we get to that. I get a little concerned with just every group being on there, because at the end we're trying to review. It's almost like a planning commission, right? We want a group that can review an application and the effects evaluation of the operation plan against the existing criteria, the criteria of Part 5. So I need to think about who's invited and serve with appeals process and minority reports. But as far as it being, as us administering it, I'm trying to think about the effectiveness of the JART and being able to help us evaluate the project against the criteria of Part 5 of the Territorial Sea Plan, which at the end of the day is our responsibility.
And that all is clear, and it's laid out, your directions are laid out in in Part 5 what the intent is here, so you can use your language and your discretion to make decisions about who gets to be on there. But at the end of the day, I mean, you start with the assumption that people want to participate, get to participate. With that said, I'm sure there's some experience with it, and the DVA raised the fact that you do have sort of comparable organizations that have been doing this for a while, so probably some history there. And I also have just a question. So how different is the JARD process, if at all, for a pilot project that for the kind of project we're talking about providing a GA or a GP versus a commercial project? What would be the difference there in terms of process?
I don't think there's much difference in the process. I think the criteria that they will be evaluating the project against will be smaller, depending on what is required out of Part 5.
So whether or not the project met the criteria that we laid out here for GA or GP would be one of the things that the JARD would say you do or do not actually meet those requirements.
Well, at least they would make a recommendation.
Sure.
Yeah, it's up to the department as the agency that authorizes it.
So you spin up a JARD for if Justin showed up tomorrow and said, hey, I'm going to deploy my device that was in the water here a few years ago. It's a little different. It's got a little different anchor. And it puts eligible power now. We're going to put it back out here at NETS. You're going to spin up the JARD?
Not for NETS.
Okay. Right. One of the refs.
Yeah, I got you. You pick a lakeside. I don't care where you are.
We're going to RESA for June through October. You going to spin up the JARD?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And I would think you'd want to do it, like I said, when they were ready to really put the rubber meets the road and through a pre-application process. I'd like to spin up the JARD so they can help us and help them work on those effects evaluations, whatever's required out of it, and the operation plan, whatever's required out of it. And then I would expect them, you said for let's say a pilot project, right, for at least to have one more meeting after the applicant has submitted all of those required materials. And as for a commercial lease, I don't know how many meetings. We'd spin up the JARD, I don't know how many meetings it would have. That depend on the scope of the project. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, part of it was rhetorical. I wanted to make sure we all understood that JARD was getting spun out for any of these projects, pretty much.
Yeah, I think the only one area they're exempt from is NETS.
Hugh and then Charlie.
And let me just, we'll go Hugh, Charlie, Rick or Joanne, or do you guys have your 10 cards up?
Yeah, I wanted to weigh in
Okay.
when you get through everybody there.
Okay, we got you. Hugh.
Great, thank you. First of all, I wanted to reassure Charlie when he said that, just because it's source group in the soft Coos Bay, totally agree. And we ran into this issue with the Principal Power Project where they came and asked the source group to look at an area and see if they could help them find an area that wouldn't affect our fleet. But our fleet is anybody that's got a permit on the Oregon coast. It's not just the local fishermen. That said, we learned some valuable lessons from that. I'm surprised no one hasn't brought it up yet. MOU has been signed between Fine and Source, and with the intent that all the nearshore groups, if you want to call it that, on the Oregon coast will be notified anytime a developer comes to one of our groups and starts talking about something like that, so that anybody that fishes in Oregon waters should know about that project, not just one group off of that part of the coast. So that said, I did want to offer the commodity commissions, which are state agencies, would be, if you notified the commodity commissions when there was going to be a JARD meeting or whatever, we represent most of the commercial fisheries in Oregon, trawl, albacore, salmon, crab. So one way or another, we could help convene, interested parties or stakeholders for that particular project. And we might be around a while longer than maybe some of the nursery groups, we hope. And when it comes to the public meeting, there's a pretty strict law. I'm sure you'll figure it out. I know with the Commodity Commission, anytime we have a chairman and up to 2 commissioners in a room, it's supposed to be public notices. So
sure.
There's pretty strict rules whenever anything's convened when you have a lot of state employees. So
Just throw that out there.
Well, with our boards, yeah, certainly we have those sort of requirements. That's a public meeting. I don't know with the agency staff if that's the same, but we can check that out. Or yes. Jerry, who's next? Charlie.
Well, I didn't think Jason's idea there was that bad, actually. I understand the concern with just kind of opening up a floodgate of opinion versus quality evaluation. But my experience with public meetings is that people don't run to them unless there's a target and a big decision or something like that that's happening. One thought is, in looking at the chart composition that's kind of spelled out in this memo and referencing what was read out of Part 5, you kind of have the agencies and to some respect maybe the commodity commissions that really can do strong evaluation of planning. And then you have kind of everybody else that may have an opinion that may not as much be in the ballpark of fully evaluating a plan and against criteria and doing the dirty work. So I'm wondering, is there a way to split that process a little bit within the JART where some of that heavy lifting kind of happens within the agency groups, or is that what the agencies are trying to sort of spread the burden of a little bit in the JART process?
I don't know. I haven't thought about weighting sort of response via JART membership.
I wouldn't really go there. I think the vision of the JART is they would be experienced in the fields that we need help on the review. And those are going to be applicable to the standards that are in Part 5. And if I remember the conversations that we had about the JARTs in the past, it was designed around the interagency function to make sure all of the state and federal agencies were communicating effectively, were making sure that they all were meeting the standards that they needed to meet, and that the inclusion of the local advisory, potentially affected groups had that added benefit of adding in some of that experiential knowledge, some of the local knowledge, site-specific knowledge that could really help in the analysis of effects evaluation and the standards. There is the public part of the process that DSL will go through that has a notice and a public comment period. And I feel like having those two does, in effect, give you both the participation from those affected groups that have kind of that official advisory status, while also having the opportunity for public comment from everybody else. So it would be my preference in the future to keep the JART focused on a smaller group of those very experienced individuals who are knowledgeable, and then have
Somebody's knocking on their microphone.
public comment afterwards.
If it wasn't you, Joanne, it must have been Rick.
Bruce fixing his sink or something.
Okay, I concur with what Andy said, actually, and that was going to be my way in too. And reading the JART composition, you're already up to about 14 to 15 bodies, and I would anticipate not everyone could make every meeting, but in any case, 14 to 15 bodies to draw from is pretty significant for an advisory commission. And as Andy said, I think with the public input would be just that. There's a public input that goes along with the process, and you would the JART would have that information as well as DSL who's administering the process. So I think it's good as is, frankly. That's a big large body to do criteria review.
Thank you, Joanne. Walter?
I'd just like to concur with the last two people, because if you look at number 4, what they're going to be advising on is pretty specific. And if you just have someone who just wants to be part of the process that has no background in this, and it could take a lot longer, or getting them up to speed might not be worth the effort to get a 30-person panel. So I think there's a difference between the JART participation and public process, public comments.
Thank you. Anybody else have any questions or comments on this topic for now? This is just for now, because we'll have we'll draft up some rule language for consideration, and we'll add some comment bubbles off the side to see where we derive that. It looks like Ms. Kelly has her comment.
Just one. So the JART is part 5. That doesn't cover cables. I get that. But I'm wondering if, since we're talking about rulemaking here, what are the rules that would apply to the cable, and whether or not there would be any interagency review team associated with the cable?
I believe that's a good point. I think something we'll have to reconcile, because our rules for a project in the territorial sea, I believe a cable that's associated with the lease currently in Division 140 is part of the leasehold. Not the same for a cable that comes from the continental shelf. That would be something different, because we don't have we're not enforcing the lease. But if we had a project, let's say off of, I don't want to say anything contentious, let's say Lakeside, a facility lease in the territorial sea with a cable going to the substation in Lakeside, that whole thing would be authorized under the lease under Division 140. So while Part 5 might not call for it, I mean, if we're valuing it all under the one application, the JART would have a chance to look at that cable, because it'd be part of our authorization. Does that sound okay to you?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I believe that cable would need to meet, the Part 2 requirements as well. So, well, Part 4 for the public process, but it would also, description, location,
yes,
burial depth, all the required pieces of information that we normally do for siting a cable.
Yeah.
Okay.
And really, a lot of the checklist for Part 5 is right from Part 2 anyway, as well.
Right, but so what I'm concerned about is that we would wind up in a situation where we're looking at a project, and the project description includes a facility site and then a cable length, right? And that the JART would be told, don't look at the cable, we're just looking at the facility, because this is under Part 5, and that's what the JART's mission is, right? And so if that's true, then is there a sub-body that looks at the cable, or is there, or are you saying then that it could either be explicitly stated or understood that the JART, when convened, would be looking at a project as a whole, including the cable?
I'll follow up with Andy, not Landy. But my expectation would be that the JART would look at the project that's being applied for, and our authorization would cover authorization with a cable associated with a facility lease would include that, so we would look at that.
Okay.
And
then what about for the projects in federal waters where it's just a cable crossing? So that would be a cable easement
under a different set of rules. The number is escaping my head, right? 83. I think it's. But then that would essentially falls Part 4.
Okay, and we are not doing anything with those rules, so that's the
rules are not open currently.
Okay, got it.
I was just going to piggyback on that exchange. And Scott could, of course, provide the same history, perhaps in better detail than I could. And I'm looking at Scott when I say this. Still, as usual, you've made a very good point here, and it's like, well, why do we have a different sort of arrangement for that versus this? And I think you need to go back into the history of all of a sudden, prior to marine energy stuff, this cable stuff was going on. There were a lot of bad conflicts. Went to the legislature. There was, again, with the Coastal Caucus, working very closely with some local people. and Scott was part of that. There was a fishing group stood up with the benefit of the Coastal Caucus saying, figure this out, and we had Governor Kitzhaber saying, go work this out before. And it was quite an act of leadership on his part that they had a company that was busy laying out a cable on its way from China, and Governor Kitzhaber, looking at in those days, looking at the Coastal Caucus, said, let's throw all these people in a room and have them work this out before we're gonna. And that was an amazing thing, right? When that happened, that's how Scott then was put onto the group, and the rest is history. But all of that that was late '90s. Even at OPAC, there was, back in that day, there was this real do we even have any? I remember being on OPAC and feeling it, Scott. I remember it was like Paula Burgess that's how long ago this was. My God, we're really dipping into our memory banks on this. But there was even OPAC was sitting there wondering if it had any authority on that, and how that was going to play out. So I think looking. So what is that? What was that preamble? What's my point?
Well, there's a cable right somewhere. There's a lot of cable.
It's sort of it's an accident. I think the different process can be explained because this other issue sort of roared out ahead. It had this great confrontation. It was dealt by standing up Oregon Fishermen's Undersea Cable Committee. So I think that's one of the reasons everybody felt very comfortable that now that there was a funded, responsible, highly effective group that could work with those coastwide interests, and you could bury cable so you didn't have these huge spatial conflicts. That's how that sort of got. I think that's how we ended up with that kind of a process, which is very interesting to hold it against how are we going to do this other stuff. I think that's the explanation.
Last one.
Yeah, if I can just respond. At the very beginning of the territorial sequence under implementation requirements, it does say that the cable that goes from the facility to shore will be covered under Part 4. So the existing process that exists will be used. And while it's not dovetailed together in this part of our JART conversation, it will be handled as it has been handled in the past.
Yeah, I just was wondering if the JART would weigh in on it. Right?
As I read this, I would say no. That's not something JART would review.
But see, then I hear Chris saying that because it's their rules, it would. So that's why, anyway, it doesn't have to be answered today, but so Part 5 handles it one way, and then DSL's rules handles it another way is my sort of...
And you're correct. Yeah, well, our rules predate Part 5. They were put in place before, so that's something we'll have to reconcile.
I'm just trying to figure out the marching order.
Yeah. So you're right. So for the record, Andy, as the keeper of Part 5, says we probably need to revisit that in our rules then, and it won't be part of the authorized use area.
Well, as a keeper of Part 2, or what's the
and Part 4?
Part of 4. 4.
So I'll schedule a meeting. We can talk about that a little bit in the interim. Try to figure out how to.
I'm only going to bring it up because, the cable does affect, based on our discussions with the South Energy test site, does affect the landing site, which has, and the route of the cable is, a pretty big point of discussion for that project. So it's really closely tied together to the project.
So is that a suggestion that we consider carefully how we reconcile this?
They need to be coordinated.
Yeah.
That's my point. Or should be coordinated to some extent. Otherwise, there's going to be a disconnect.
I agree. But I don't know that you need all the members of the JART to go through that
Maybe not.
process. And that's the one significant difference.
Okay, we'll take a look at that and figure out that's something that will need to be. There's a lot of things in the existing rules that need to be updated based on part of the adoption of Part 5 and the other legislation that's been enacted since then, and that's another one. So thank you. And thank you, Laura.
We'll just add quickly, one last thing. It strikes me that, at least from fishing industry groups, because there is an OFCC, that constituency probably is very comfortable with the current arrangement. I look at it, Charlie and others say, well, wait a minute, I'm not sure. Well, one of the reasons, that I'm not trying to do your advocacy for you, but I can see other constituents saying, wait a minute, on that cable stuff, I'm not sure other things are real. I'm not sure other constituencies really have the kind of access to the process that they would seek if they felt uncomfortable about cables.
Thank you. Joanna Rigg, one last bite at the apple.
I'll pass, thank you.
I'll pass as well.
All right, thanks. I've got one more memo for today, and I can leave it as homework. I can go through it real quick. There's no action, really questions for y'all. I did have a telephone conversation with BOEM about their leasing process and in particular sort of their decommissioning and their financial assurance information requirements, to kind of see how they did that. So I tried to summarize that for you there. Some of it's interesting, some of it is very, it's interesting to compare, but a lot of our decommissioning requirements are very prescriptive, not from Part 5 as much as from state statute that's been enacted the last 4 or 5 years. It looks like they actually require, through Part 5, we require, and through current law, we require some very detailed decommissioning plans and, of course, financial assurance up front. And they require their requirements are a little more general up front, but then require you to submit detailed plans towards the end of the life of the project. One thing I thought that was interesting for Jerry, who deals a lot with insurance, probably has to look at more insurance policies than she's would care to, is that they didn't require any insurance requirements with their leases on the continental shelf. They have indemnification language, but no requirements for no insurance requirements. And we have a plethora of insurance requirements as the state for leasing. We always have insurance requirements with the state named as additional insured, and we also have indemnification language. Another thing I thought was very interesting, though, was that financial assurance is required not just for decommissioning through the BOEM leases, but for meeting the terms and conditions of the lease. So they have a lease-specific bond of $100,000 that can be used to ensure the compliance with the terms and conditions of the lease. We have that ability to do that. We don't, but it's not the norm that section usually sits blank in our leases. So.
Just $100K.
Yeah, for their leases, that they're upfront. They have ability through their phase process to add different financial assurance mechanisms, but that's their upfront bond required for the terms and conditions of the lease. They also have supplemental bonds can be required as the project expands and evolves. And then they have a decommissioning bond and other financial assurance to be determined by BOEM on the anticipated decommissioning costs. And
that doesn't strike you as the functional equivalent of insurance. If you have adequately bonds that are by God is there and you can access it, that isn't really like seen as insured.
Oh,
did I misunderstand?
No, maybe that's what they're claiming is their insurance. You're saying as opposed to having a general liability insurance policy, they've got bonding.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's it goes right after the same. And now it begs the question: is there enough money there?
Yeah,
I mean, some token bonding requirement, like $100K for a big project is laughable. You can't begin to do something with $100K out there if something goes wrong. But that to me, that's addressing the same thing. You do it all the time. If a local government is asking someone to build a sewer plant for them, by God, there's bonding requirements. There's no doubt that if the contractor messes it up, that there's a readily accessible, clear pot of money to make it right. I mean, you just don't even do stuff unless you've got that kind. And whether you call it insurance or whether you call it an adequately sized, readily accessible bond, it's really addressing the same thing. Things have gone south. Now we need to fix it. They're not doing it.
Yeah.
Here's how we're going to remedy that.
Well, the state through our DAS and business transaction services is really veered towards the insurance route, and we have coverage of like negligence. If there's gross negligence that occurs and somebody hurts themselves, but maybe it's the grass always green. I kind of like the bonding requirements and having something you can pull as opposed to trying to go through an insurance.
Well, let's all remember during the financial crisis, AIG had this, which was otherwise a stellar insurance company, was ensuring banks loaning money with each other with credit default swaps. And they didn't call it insurance, they called it a contract. And then AIG neglected to have any money set aside when the inevitable would happen, where all of a sudden people are not paying, each bank is not paying each other back because they're frozen and they can't meet those margin requirements. And then everybody runs to AIG and says, well, you were going to indemnify me. And AIG says, oh, tough luck. You screwed up. You trusted me. I don't have any money to pay for that.
Yeah, and I would say, this is Joanne, I would say bonding is much more appropriate for industries that are not well established, done in planning all the time. We do not, insurance is more like, I know working for the state, Chris, we have that in our contract for contracting for, consultants and contractors. That makes sense because they're a business, they're well established, that they're registered with the state, and they know those insurance provisions. For this kind of activity, I would say it's not appropriate. I would look at modifying the language and the rules on that as well, and going more towards bonding. I think it does set aside a trust, if you will, to use to address any issues that come up. It may not address all issues, but it will address a good chunk of them, whereas insurance, you like you said, you'll be sitting for years and it won't address anything. So I think it could be an improvement to look at actually following the route that Boehm does and use bonding.
Thank you. That's something we're going to take into consideration. Being able to enforce, besides decommissioning, being able to enforce the other terms and conditions of our authorizations was a point of concern that was brought up by multiple RAC members during our roundtable on that first.
Well, and to make sure you got the proper skill sets when you're devising what that bond is, that you're talking to people like Rick Williams, not that people that have actually worked in the ocean and have thought through what happens when things go south and I have to do something.
Right, and I guess the last point, and notice the developer doesn't estimate the cost of decommissioning in the BOEM contract. They contract that out to a third-party estimator to establish the amount of financial assurance needed for the decommissioning based on the approved decommissioning application, which they submit towards the end, which I thought was interesting. We allow our statute has the developer submit that cost estimate that has to be done by a person who's qualified. It's a little vague, but it's something else for us to think about in our rulemaking. So I wanted to share that with you. There's links to the CFRs if anyone's interested in looking at those on the memo we submitted. So submitted to the RAC. We are pretty much on time. The last thing is really the next steps.
I do have one thing about the BOEM memo.
Yes, sir.
The BOEM guideline on 15 feet below mudline.
Yes.
I researched that when I was on the International Electrotechnical Commission, Marine Energy Design. It came out during the tenure of Dr. Charles Smith at Minerals Management. And the 15 feet was driven by the Navy for the purpose of terminating Texas towers and being able to bottom nuclear submarines. This goes back way far. We're not talking about Texas towers. We don't bottom nuclear submarines anymore. And I can almost say without any risk of being wrong, there will not be any nuclear submarines bottoming in the Oregon Territorial Sea. So if anybody was looking at our 1 meter versus their 15 meters, there's a long history from the Gulf that doesn't apply.
Well, and if there are nuclear submarines bottoming in the territorial sea, we'll have other things to worry about.
This is true.
Thank you for touching on that, Rick. It was one of the bullets I put on there. Yes, you're right. That is one of the contrasting numbers because, as you know, the state statute allows cables and such to be buried below 1 meter.
Right, which is appropriate.
Place. Thank you. That just reminded me. Okay, yes, public comment. Do we have any public comment today? Thank you, Jerry. Next steps, I think we're hoping to have a meeting in September. Does the end of September work for people? Oh, it's for the conference. Okay.
Everyone knows
Yes.
conference, September 21st, 22nd. So fishermen, members of the fishing community are free. There's an NGO government rate.
Did you get that figured out on the registration page?
I think so. I think it just says NGO, but that counts as you guys.
We'll certainly send out a doodle poll on that. Just off the top, I'm trying to figure out what might be a good week, let's say, or a couple week block to have the next meeting.
I'd like to request that we go with either the week of the 5th, understanding Monday's a holiday, or the week of the 26th, because I've got a conflict the week of the 12th.
And Jason, when was your
21st, the week of the 21st, 22nd. And there's events every day that week except Friday.
So the final, I don't think we're going to be have everything materials ready to go and get out to you guys ahead of time for the week of Labor Day. But maybe that last week, Rick, you were saying the week of the 26th is the week after your conference.
Right, that'd be great, and we might have something to talk about after the conference too.
So, just my own self-interest, I'm leaving basically hopefully the day after my conference for a much needed vacation. Go back to Wyoming, go fly fishing for a few days. So I'll be gone that next week.
Okay.
However, on October 10th and 11th in Newport is the Oregon chapter of the Marine Technology Society's conference. It's right here in Newport. That's a Monday and a Tuesday. I'll be here if you headed up, be hosting it on that Wednesday.
That's a good idea.
Remember October 10th. So it'll be the 12th.
Got some dates towards the last week of September at work and the first couple weeks of October. How is everyone else looking week-wise? Let's say the week after. Eli's good to go. Okay.
What? That's not what I said.
How's your calendar like? I'm trying to figure out just if I should do a poll.
I don't have it with
the
me.
week of the 10th. Okay.
There wasn't any contract identified for mid-September. If you could get the materials done in time for like a September 15th, 16th, so that would be. So.
Yeah, I had a conflict, but that's just one person.
Okay. Well, we will round back at the office and look at the weeks, at least around, not including the weeks of the week of the conference. So for the next meeting, I think that'll mostly be a regulatory meeting discussing general permit language, draft general permit language, maybe try to follow up on some of these takeaways with regards to first right to refusal and touching back with Andy on the authorized use area and the tables associated with the lease. Scott and Rick thinking about the area, maybe how area should translate for first right to apply. But mostly, I think it would be a regulatory show out, so maybe some draft general permit language. Next meeting, I think probably hopefully have some draft leasing language to look at. And the meeting after that, I would think we need to, once we have some draft language for both proprietary and regulatory rules, start to discuss a new fee regime, both administrative fees and leasing fees. So that's sort of my thoughts for the next 3 meetings, and then kind of see where we are at that point. Sound okay? Well, it's just about 1 o'clock. Does anybody have any last words?
Thank you for coming to report.
It's always good to get to the report, so I'm not making a draft.
Well, once again, thank you guys for just your time and your participation in this. We appreciate it, and we look forward to the next meeting. Thank you. Thanks, Ryan. Thank you.